My name is Hadden.
My name is Simone. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Wayne, for inviting us to speak, and thank you all for sharing your knowledge and your experiences and reflections with us. I think we really appreciated it because we're in a project connected to this, basically doing an intervention within the Tropenmuseum, which is part of the big National Museum for World Cultures that this museum, the Volkenkunde Museum, also belongs to. And we're here to share our sort of experience of what that intervention looked like, what that was, what the process was like, but also our sort of dilemmas and challenges and the politics of doing that. Our colleague Tilde Balk isn't here today, but the three of us are activists and organizers and black women, women of color, with different colonial histories that have shaped our families' histories, and we've all grown up in the Netherlands. In our activism and organizing, we critique and challenge what Bell Hooks calls the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist, ableist heteropatriarchy. I think some other people added the hetero of the part of the heteropatriarchy and ableist part, but we think those are valuable additions. Those sort of connected oppressions in Dutch mainstream media, academia, border politics, and also within activist spaces that we're part of. We create our own media, our own spaces to have conversations that are about understanding how these oppressions work in our lives, both on an interpersonal level and an institutional level. And I say all of this because this is our background. We are not academics. We do not have a background in sort of working in museums, etc. We work from an embodied experience of being confronted with the everyday effects of colonial thinking in its many forms, and our own experience as visitors to the Tropenmuseum before getting involved in this project showed us that that museum is absolutely essential in reproducing that colonial thinking. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Tropenmuseum, perhaps it has exhibitions on Southeast Asia, Oceania, Western Asia, North Africa, Africa. This is from the website, so all the distinctions that I'm making are from the website. Africa, Latin America, and then music, dance, and theater. So it's an ethnographic museum, it's a colonial museum, it's a problematic museum. So whereas we usually sort of happily stand on the outside of institutions such as this museum, critiquing and demanding change, we found ourselves being invited to do that more or less from the inside of the museum when we were invited by Laura van Broekhoven and Wayne to share our critique and to create an intervention to disrupt the colonial violence that is being perpetrated within the museum. So this intervention, what did it look like? The shape the intervention took is a series of conversations with different, first of all, really kind of like honest conversations that we had with Wayne and Laura, which were really important to feel like these are people that are basically part of management that are sort of professionally but personally and politically committed to ending the institutional violence that is sort of so obvious, you know, within the Tropenmuseum. It's happening so obviously. So that was a long process of conversations where they were like, yeah, we can't do this alone from within, so we want to engage in conversation with you, and we want to ask you to create an intervention within the museum that we can also sort of leverage to feed, sort of mobilize, disrupt whatever is happening already within the museum as a whole to create change. So that was really important to us. I think we didn't come in being like, you need to change, and we were sort of paid to do like a little project, but they were already engaged in a huge sort of project that they were committed to, and we were a part of that. So we were game. We were like, interested, I think. We were suspicious, but we liked the people. But I'm going to be honest, Wayne. we were sort of like, of course, when you're invited by an institution like that, you're sort of, I think we all felt like, you know, we're committed to do something, and if we have the opportunity to do it somehow in a different way than we're used to, from the inside, without being sort of, without compromising ourselves, then we can try that. So we did, and we were really sort of, I think, really happy to work together with Wayne and Laura and the curators. So what was this intervention? What did it look like? It was a series of conversations, at first with us, and then we invited a group of critical people, friends and friends of friends, mostly people of color, mostly between the ages of 20 and 35, and we asked them to come to the museum and tell us what they honestly thought. Many of them were of African descent, and yeah, people of different genders and sexualities. We asked them how walking through the museum made them feel, what stood out, most of them, what they hoped to gain from the visit, what kind of expectations they had, and how they think the museum needs to change to stop reproducing violence. I think it's important to know that many of the people that were part of the project ended up having quite a traumatic experience just walking through the museum. Many of them are connected to the histories and the cultures and the peoples that are represented in the museum. Maybe they're of Indonesian descent, or Surinamese, or Ethiopian, and there were such misrepresentations and just a lot of different ways in which the truth wasn't being told, and it went even beyond that, but I'll go into that later. That people felt really kind of sometimes very horrible after going into the museum for an hour and then coming back, and then us being there and asking them, what did you think? And they would be like, I need a moment, So we had honest conversations, and Wayne and Laura and Annette were there for some of those conversations to listen and to give a little bit of context, because people had questions like, what the fuck is, what's going on here? And they could give a little bit of context, even though most of them were not involved in setting up the museum as it is now. They could provide a little bit of background into the decision-making processes that go behind what's going on. So I'm talking really fast because I feel it's necessary. I hope you can. I'm still making sense.
Are we doing on time? Excellent, I think.
Okay. Okay, so and then a big part of the intervention was also to basically write texts that would be installed in the museum as sort of temporary installations that respond to the texts that are in the museum, respond to the exhibition. So as a visual sort of disruption, and as also a way to correct and challenge and critique the narratives that are represented within the museum. So we asked also a group of the people that participated in the conversations to write these texts with us, to talk back to the exhibitions. And then another part of the intervention is to have sort of formal and informal conversations with the staff to explain our position and our analysis, how and why the museum is reproducing racist hierarchies and colonial violence. So the group's visits and conversations led to the following conclusions about the language and exhibitions in the Tropenmuseum. We feel they are reproducing colonial racist hierarchies, presenting white Westerners as continuously, structurally, as the civilized ones, the active agent, the one bringing civilization to a passive, primitive, uncivilized, non-Western peoples. There is an erasure of the agency and perspectives of non-Western colonized peoples, which is in stark contrast to the way that colonial sort of individuals are almost, sort of glorified. We don't really get to know who the people behind the objects are, but we do sort of get to know intimately sometimes the histories of individuals, white Dutch colonialists who have been part of the Dutch colonial project. So there is, on the one hand, this erasure of the agency and perspectives of non-Western colonized peoples, and then on the other hand, there's very clearly in the way the texts are written that accompany the exhibition. The writers of the text are speaking from and for a white gaze, which privileges the perspectives and stories of white colonizers. It's speaking to a white Dutch, sort of assumption is the person who is visiting the museum is a white Dutch person. And then there's also an erasure of colonial violence and profits and the gains of the colonial project. Dutch colonial project is minimized. And lastly, but like hugely, colonialism is glorified as a civilizing project. Progress, trade, discovery, science are emphasized. And some examples are, I don't know if you can read this. So this is about Suriname, one of the colonies of, used to be one of the Dutch colonies, and the way that you can see it most in the Dutch text, and that's also an interesting difference that the people who participated in the project saw, that there seems to be like structurally a difference in the way that the Dutch text is written and the English text is written, where the English one is a little bit more politically correct usually, but the Dutch is quite sort of, maybe a little bit more honest. So here you see, for example, that the meager profits from these estates went directly to the Netherlands in the first part of the text. Also in the Dutch, also in the English, you see, Suriname remained a colony dependent on the Netherlands. It's a complete reversal of the situation. Yeah, it's like, I don't know, we gloss over also the agency of people fighting for their own liberation when we say, after a period of self-governance, independence was declared. There isn't really a lot of, even though colonial history is a big part of what's in the museum, there's hardly any mention of struggles for liberation, independence, decolonization is not really too much of a theme. So this is only one example. Here we have another example of what I mean with sort of focusing on the perspectives and the stories and experiences of white colonialists. Here you see the person that you see is sort of like a Madame Tussauds type of statue, and you have several of these, maybe 6 or so. These are all white people. One of them is not, I think. This is in the Dutch East Indies part of the exhibition, and you see a little bit. There's a little sort of like plaque, and it says what the person was doing. Obviously, an important sort of rich person within, and it's kind of disturbing because you don't see this. There is no such thing. This in like a person from the Dutch East Indies who is not white isn't represented in the same ways. They're sort of like faceless, nameless masses of people. And then here you see there's a plaque commemorating this person, George Tillman, who sort of created a lot of the collection in the Twelfth Museum is from his personal collection. And we don't really get that story. I'll skip that one. Get that story in the same way from the people who created all the objects that are in the museum.
Thank you. That was really good. Okay, I have 2 more minutes. I'm going to talk really, really fast because I think what's important to know about the focus groups that we had was who was in the groups. Because as people mentioned before, like we're having a conversation. In the Netherlands, you don't really have a conversation about colonialism because if you have it with the wrong people or with a specific kind of group, you get stuck on this very apologetic nature. So we were very adamant about getting people in the room that we can left the conversation at a specific point. Instead of having to justify that, saying that you are not a bad person, not all white people, not all colonizers, we want to have a conversation that really dived into the conversation that we needed to be having. I have 2 more minutes, such pressure. So the recommendations we summarized from these conversations are as followed: to reevaluate the current gaze, position, and authority of ethnographic museums in their current form. The current form being that of an immovable mothership of colonialism. Because I don't think the perspective really changes. So you have a project or you have a special, but what are the structural changes of a museum? How can you make this more part of the collective identity and the collective memory of the Netherlands? Second point is decentering whiteness and the Eurocentric gaze, which my dear colleague also discussed, and with regards to who's looking at these plaques, at these displays, who is it built for? Who is it written for? Who wants to not be, and I think somebody mentioned this before, who wants to not feel this discomfort when getting to know the other person? Third point is creating a space to learn and unlearn, emphasis on the unlearning, active, embodied, reflexive empathy. I think that speaks for itself. Last one is taking ethnographic museums from the academic spheres to the social justice sphere, which is exactly why we created the hashtag, to make it much more accessible for people. And also, I think, to get into that space of, like we see in South Africa, where the roads must fall and the fees must fall. This is for us, for young people who have the privilege of being online, to have that conversation and not wait for the permission to have that conversation. This is us saying, this is what is interesting to us, this is what is necessary for us. And whether or not you invite us into the space with everybody at the board meeting, these are the conversations we're going to be having. So that was, wait, am I doing on time?
Yeah.
This is it?
Perfect.
In 2 minutes. You can book me for all your parties. I think these are the questions we might be able to address when we're on the panel. Thank you so much for your time.